Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty wild. Kandinsky's Composition 8.
Oh, yeah. This one's a doozy.
It is. I mean, even for abstract art, this is out there.
Yeah.
And I know you picked it, so you must be ready to, really unpack this.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those paintings that you can stare at for hours and still find something new every time.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the appeal of abstract art,
Yeah.
right? It's not about, figuring out a hidden message or anything. It's about, letting the colors and shapes wash over you and just feeling something.
It's more about experiencing it than interpreting it.
Exactly.
Uh,
So before we dive into the specifics of Composition 8, I kind of want to step back and talk about Kandinsky's journey as an artist.
Mhm.
How did he even get to this point?
yeah, you can't really understand Composition 8 without understanding the path he took to get there.
So where do we even begin?
Well, believe it or not, he actually started off as an expressionist painter.
Really? So all about emotions, right?
Yeah.
Capturing those raw feelings on canvas.
Precisely. And one of his most important pieces from this period is Der Blaureiter, or the Blue Rider, which is actually still pretty representational. It's a figure on horseback, but even in this piece, you can see him starting to play with color in a way that hints at his later abstract work.
So even though the subject matter is still somewhat traditional, he's already pushing the boundaries of what color can do.
Exactly. He was using these vibrant, almost unreal colors and blending them in a way that went beyond just depicting the scene. It's like he was already exploring the emotional power of color itself rather than just using it to, paint a realistic picture.
Interesting. So he was already kind of planting those seeds of abstraction even in his early work.
Absolutely. And that desire to break free from the constraints of representation led him to join a group called the NKVM, the New Artists Association of Munich.
Okay, and this was a group of artists who were all about pushing the envelope, exploring new ways of expressing themselves.
Exactly. They were all about challenging the norms of the art world.
Sounds like the perfect place for Kandinsky at that stage of his career.
It was. And it was during his time with the NKVM that his work took a really decisive turn towards abstraction.
So he was ditching those recognizable subjects and just going full on abstract.
Pretty much. Yeah, he started to move away from depicting, objects and scenes in a realistic way and started using titles like composition or impression or improvisation for his works.
So it was less about painting what he saw, and more about painting what he felt.
Precisely. He was more interested in conveying an idea or an emotion or even a musical experience than just a visual representation.
Oh yeah, the music connection. We're definitely going to dig into that later, especially since you're a musician yourself. But first, what about the NKVM? Did Kandinsky stay with them throughout his career?
He didn't actually, and it's kind of a funny story in a way.
Oh, really? What happened?
Well, get this, he actually had a painting rejected from their annual exhibition.
Oh, no way. Rejected from his own group. That's gotta hurt.
Yeah, it was a bit of a blow. And it ultimately led him to leave the NKVM and co-found a new group with the artist Franz Marc called Der Blaureiter.
Wait a minute. Two groups, same name. That's a little confusing.
Yeah, I know. But this new Der Blaureiter was a bit different. They were still expressionistic, but this group placed a much stronger emphasis on the spiritual dimension of art.
Okay, and that was something that was really important to Kandinsky, right? That idea that art could connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. He believed that art had the power to transcend the physical world and touch on something deeper, something spiritual.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces are fitting together.
Yeah.
We've got the expressionism, the spirituality, the interest in music, all these things that are going to eventually lead us to Composition 8.
Absolutely. But before we jump ahead to that, there's one more crucial stop on Kandinsky's journey that we need to talk about.
Ah, you're talking about the Bauhaus, that legendary design school that had such a huge influence on everything from art and architecture to furniture and typography.
It was a real game changer, and it's where Kandinsky really honed his use of geometric forms.
So did his paintings become super minimalist, all clean lines and sharp angles?
Not entirely. He still retained that emotional and spiritual core that was so central to his work. But the Bauhaus definitely influenced his style, particularly in his use of geometric elements.
So it was more like a fusion of influences, taking the structure and discipline of the Bauhaus and blending it with his own unique artistic vision.
Exactly. And it's this constant evolution, this blending of influences that makes Kandinsky so fascinating. But sadly, his time at the Bauhaus was cut short by,
The rise of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter in history. The Nazis declared the Bauhaus degenerate art and shut it down in the early 1930s.
Wow. So Kandinsky had to flee Germany?
He did. He ended up in France, where he lived in exile for the rest of his life.
So even in the face of all that upheaval, he kept painting. Kept exploring new artistic territories.
He did. It's really remarkable. And it was in France that he created Composition 8th, the work that we're going to be diving into today.
Okay, so we've talked about Kandinsky's journey from Expressionism to the Bauhaus to exile in France, but we haven't really talked about the music connection yet. And I know you said we'd get to it later, but I'm dying to know, like, how does Kandinsky's love of music show up in Composition 8?
Well, I think that's the perfect segue into our next section. We're about to dive into the world of Kandinsky's synesthesia, his belief that music and art are intertwined, and how that all translates to the canvas.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Let's unpack this visual symphony and see what secrets it holds.
You know, it's really interesting. Kandinsky actually referred to some of his paintings as compositions or improvisations, terms that we usually associate with music.
Right, like he wasn't just using those terms randomly. He actually saw a deep connection between painting and music.
Exactly. He believed they were intertwined. And he even went so far as to say that color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, and the soul is the piano with many strings.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
Yeah.
So he was basically saying that colors are like musical notes and the act of painting is like a performance.
Precisely. And this brings us to synesthesia, which is this really fascinating phenomenon where the stimulation of one sense triggers an experience in another sense. Like you might hear a sound and see a color, or taste a flavor and feel a texture.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It's like those people who can see sounds or taste shapes.
Exactly. Now, it's not definitively known whether or not Kandinsky actually had synesthesia, but he did describe experiencing colors when listening to music, particularly during a performance of Wagner's opera Lohengrin.
So like he'd hear a soaring melody and simultaneously see a burst of yellow or feel a wave of blue wash over him during a somber chord.
Precisely. And whether or not he had synesthesia, his deep connection to music is undeniable. You can see it throughout his work. And critics often describe Composition 8 as a visual symphony with different elements coming together to create a harmonious whole.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We got Kandinsky's journey from Expressionism to the Bauhaus, his spiritual leanings, his love of music, and possibly even synesthesia. But how does all of that actually translate into the visual elements of Composition 8? Like, what should we be looking for when we look at this painting?
Well, let's start with that big black circle at the top left of the painting, the one with the purple center and the pink outer ring. You mentioned that earlier. Remember how Kandinsky was fascinated by circles? They became a recurring motif in his later work.
Right, and that one almost has like a halo effect. Is that connected to his interest in spirituality?
It's quite possible circles have often been associated with spiritual concepts like wholeness, eternity, the divine. So Kandinsky might be using that circle to represent something transcendent, something beyond the material world.
That makes sense given his belief that art could connect us to a higher realm. What about all the other shapes and lines, though? They seem to be arranged in a way that's both chaotic and harmonious at the same time.
That's one of the most intriguing things about Composition 8, this tension between order and chaos, structure and spontaneity. You've got these geometric shapes, triangles, squares, circles that provide a sense of order, but they're arranged in a way that feels dynamic and unpredictable.
It's like he's playing with our expectations. We expect geometric shapes to be neat and tidy, but he throws them into this whirlwind of color and movement.
Exactly. And then you've got those bold, sweeping lines that cut across the canvas, adding another layer of energy. It's like they're conducting the whole visual orchestra, creating a sense of rhythm and movement.
And yet, even though there's so much going on, it doesn't feel overwhelming. It actually feels quite balanced.
That's because Kandinsky was a master of composition. He knew how to arrange all these elements in a way that created visual harmony, even amidst the seeming chaos.
You know, I read that Composition 8 is often compared to Composition 7, which Kandinsky painted about 10 years earlier. And there's a noticeable shift in his style between the two.
That's a great observation. Composition 7 is definitely much more chaotic, more emotionally charged. It's like a visual representation of a storm, all swirling colors and dynamic lines.
Whereas Composition 8 feels more restrained, more contemplative almost.
Absolutely. It's as if Kandinsky had distilled his artistic vision down to its essence, achieving a greater sense of clarity and control. The colors are still vibrant, but there's a sense of balance and harmony that wasn't as pronounced in his earlier work.
It's amazing how an artist's style can evolve over time, reflecting their life experiences and artistic explorations. Speaking of exploration, didn't Kandinsky also experiment with biomorphic forms during his time in France? Like those shapes inspired by nature and organic life.
He did.
Yeah.
And you can actually see hints of that in Composition 8, particularly in the way some of the shapes seem to flow and morph into one another. It's as if he's blending the geometric with the organic, creating a sense of both structure and fluidity.
So cool. It's like he's constantly pushing the boundaries of abstraction, finding new ways to express his vision. But we've talked a lot about Kandinsky's influences and his artistic journey. What about the meaning behind Composition 8? Like, what was he trying to communicate with this specific piece?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And ultimately, it's up to each individual viewer to find their own meaning in the work. But we can look for clues in Kandinsky's own writings and his exploration of spirituality in music.
So it's not about finding the right interpretation. It's more about engaging with the work on a personal level and allowing it to evoke our own thoughts and emotions.
Exactly. Kandinsky believed that art should be experienced, not just analyzed. He wanted viewers to approach his work with an open mind and heart, to let go of preconceived notions and simply allow themselves to be moved by the visual symphony he created.
Okay, I love that. So how can we apply that to our own experience of Composition 8? What are some things to keep in mind as we look at this painting?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Kandinsky wasn't trying to represent a specific object or scene or tell a literal story. He was trying to evoke a feeling, a mood, an experience. So when you look at Composition 8, try to let go of that need to figure it out and just observe. What emotions does it stir in you? What does it make you think about?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to find a hidden meaning or symbolism, but maybe the real beauty is in the experience itself, like just letting those colors and shapes wash over you.
Exactly. Pay attention to the colors. How do they interact with each other? What kind of energy do they create? Notice the lines and the shapes. Do they feel chaotic or harmonious? Do they evoke a sense of movement or stillness?
It's almost like we're detectives looking for clues. But instead of solving a crime, we're unlocking a feeling.
I like that analogy. And don't forget that musical element. Remember, Kandinsky believed that painting and music were deeply connected. So try to imagine Composition 8 as a piece of music. What kind of tempo would it have? Would it be like a grand symphony or a more free-flowing jazz improvisation?
Now that you mention it, I can almost hear the music swelling as my eyes move across the canvas. It's like those bold lines are conducting a visual orchestra, and those vibrant colors are the instruments.
And here's something you can try at home later. Listen to a piece of music that you find emotionally powerful while you're looking at Composition 8. See how the music influences your experience of the art. Do the colors seem more intense? Do the shapes take on new meaning?
Oh, wow, that's such a cool idea. It's like creating your own synesthetic experience, blending music and art together in a way that Kandinsky might have envisioned.
Exactly. It's a way to engage with the artwork on a deeper, more personal level, which is ultimately what Kandinsky hoped for. He wanted his art to be a catalyst for individual experience and interpretation.
This has been such an incredible deep dive into the world of Kandinsky and Composition 8. We've explored his fascinating artistic journey from Expressionism to the Bauhaus, his love of music, the idea of synesthesia, and how all of that comes together in this one groundbreaking work of abstract art.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to unpack all of that with you. Hopefully this has given everyone listening a few new ways to think about and appreciate Kandinsky and abstract art in general.
Absolutely. It's reminding me that sometimes the most powerful art is the art that makes us feel, think, and question, even if we don't have all the answers. And a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about Kandinsky. And remember, next time you see a piece of abstract art, don't be afraid to let go of the need for a concrete meaning or explanation. Just let yourself experience it. Let it wash over you. You might be surprised by what you discover.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Kandinsky's Composition 8. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different piece of art history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking at the world with open eyes.